precise motivation for the killing Charlie Kirk is still unclear, but some conservatives are framing it as part of a broader assault by the left on the right. There have been several instances of political violence in recent years, driven in part by sharp polarization along political lines. Now, in the first half of this year alone, some 150 politically motivated attacks have been recorded, nearly twice the number from the same period last year. Between the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021 by pro-Trump supporters and the president's second electoral victory in November 2024, at least 300 cases of political violence have been recorded. That's the most significant surge since the 1970s. Targets have spanned the political spectrum, including diplomats, law enforcement, judges, and elected officials and their families as well. In 2022, the husband of former U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and a Democrat was attacked at home. That same year, conservative-leaning Justice Brett Kavanaugh was the target of an attempted assassination. In June this year, a Democratic Minnesota state lawmaker and her husband were shot dead by Christian nationalists. Donald Trump himself faced two assassination attempts last year, one in July when a gunman shot his ear during a campaign rally, and another in September when a man with a rifle staked out the American leader's Florida golf course with a rifle. His criminal trial began yesterday.
And for more insight into the implications of the killing of Charlie Kirk, let's speak now with Javed Ali, who's Associate Professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at Michigan University. He's also a former senior official at the National Security Council during the first Trump administration. Professor Ali, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about the latest, the FBI releasing images of a person of interest. The FBI Director, Kash Patel, is there. There's a hefty reward as well. Does this mean they're struggling to find him and need the public's help, or are there other reasons, for releasing public images, if you like, of the alleged shooter?
Well, Arnold and Julie, nice to be with you. And based on some of the details that you've just shared, it certainly suggests that perhaps the actual identity of this individual has not yet been, the FBI does not know who that person is specifically. So that's why putting the reward out, having the image out will potentially bring in more tips and clues and help build the evidentiary picture that is being developed right now. But these things take time, and I can go through several similar events, whether it's terrorism or other high-profile criminal acts, where in some circumstances, these things can be resolved relatively quickly, where either the person or persons are found and apprehended, or they get in a shootout with law enforcement, or they wind up taking their own life, not suggesting that will specifically happen here. On the other hand, there have been times where it takes weeks, months, even years to find people. So it's just so hard to know how even these steps that have emerged since yesterday, whether it'll accelerate the end state to finding this individual.
Right, Prof. Ali, I want to tap on your experience with domestic terrorism to ask you about the images. We know also about the shooter's escape route, and supposedly we have some writing scrawled on the rifle and ammo that was recovered, from the woods close by. They had cultural associations. Is that enough to form, an early picture of who the shooter might be and his or her motives?
I mean, that could be, but again, that is only probably just a small sliver of whatever picture is being developed right now, because we don't even know who this person is by name and their background and their life story and everything that drove them to the moment of actually conducting this terrible attack against Charlie Kirk. So it's still, I think, very preliminary to figure out what the ideological motivation is. But some of the features of the attack are also really interesting when you take a step back. So on the one hand, very methodical and deliberate and obviously planned. And the fact that the shooter was able to get a single shot off and hit Charlie Kirk at a considerable distance, I mean, that is no small feat. I'm not a firearms expert, but just sort of thinking about it from my own past experience. But on the flip side, dropped the gun or left it, and perhaps has left other clues that are now being amassed and looked at, either physical clues or digital clues or electronic clues. So it's also really difficult to sort of build the total profile on this person, so because we've seen different sort of sides to that individual, from being able to carry out the attack, but then being very hasty and sloppy in the aftermath of it as well.
Questions to be answered there, but what we know for sure is that this latest shooting, adding to a disturbing pattern of political violence in the U.S., Professor, what are the forces driving the surge?
Well, Julie, you did a really nice job at the beginning of the segment, sort of laying out some of those recent events, but nobody really can describe, if they're being honest with themselves, all the sort of key factors that are sort of propelling the country in this moment, which is also not unique, as you pointed out earlier. I mean, there have been waves of this kind of political violence in the United States through the country's history, which includes the assassination of 4 presidents and near misses with President Reagan in 1981 and President Trump, as you also mentioned, last year. So this kind of targeted political violence isn't new. We're just seeing another surge of it. But the factors that are driving it, I could list off 10 things, and all 10 of those things could be wrong, and there could be 10 other ones that are really, really the factor. So I think it's going to take some more time to sort of understand the different social and political and cultural dynamics that are driving this, and probably even technology too, with the role of social media and everything that's out there. So there's no one single answer to that. It's always a combination of several factors at once.
Understood. Prof. Ali, you worked in the first Trump administration where you handled domestic terrorism. I think I mentioned that. But I'm curious, how much worse has it become since then?
Well, when I was in government, which included my last year of government in the Trump White House for National Security Council from 2017 to 2018, there was a sort of a noticeable uptick in these acts of domestic extremism here across sort of the ideological spectrum. But still, even in that time, the much bigger terrorist threat to the United States was an external one from the jihadist groups. Certainly ISIS is a first amongst equals, and then Al-Qaeda and its affiliates around the world. And that really was the number one threat we were focused on, certainly in the year that I was there in the Trump administration. Since then, yes, there has been, as Julie described, this uptick in domestic attacks here from a wide variety of actors across the ideological spectrum. They're not all just coming from either the far left or the far right. But that could also begin to recede in intensity, and we could see another uptick in jihadist threats as well. And that's just the enduring nature of terrorism. It ebbs and flows. There are these different waves. They're driven. The waves are driven by a combination of different factors. We just may be in a wave right now where you've got a pronounced level of activity on the domestic side, but 10 years from now, it could look more like what I had to deal with in my career from the early 2000s to the late 2010s, when for the most part, we were dealing with jihadist threats overseas.
Okay. So we're already hearing, Professor, calls for a retribution from some right-wing circles. Just how concerned are you about a chain reaction here, whether it's retaliatory attacks, civil unrest, or even imitators?
Yeah, I don't think we're at the point where we're going to have civil unrest. So I could be totally wrong. But there's, in the aftermath of every one of these high-profile attacks, whether they're jihadists, whether they're far left, whether they're far right. One of the things in my former world, we always used to think about, will there be what we would call copycat attacks, or will there be people who are sort of sitting on the sidelines ideologically, but then in the aftermath of seeing one of these successful attacks or attempted attacks, mobilize to violent action themselves? And that is near impossible to predict, certainly at an individual level, unless you actually have an investigation on somebody already, which oftentimes that doesn't happen in these certainly in the lone offender attacks. So it's so hard to predict. This is something that law enforcement and FBI and parts of the U.S. intelligence community are going to look for. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but this is just part of the sort of cycle that the counterterrorism community and law enforcement community will try to think through in the aftermath of a terrible attack like what happened yesterday.
Prof. Ali, many believe the one man who can calm things down is President Trump, but we know he's already blaming the radical left and he's vowed a crackdown on political violence. I'm not sure how he intends to do that. How critical is it, in your view, for the president to take the lead and say, you know, let's stop this, let's calm things down, or do you feel that this already has a life and momentum of its own?
Yeah, it also very difficult for me to kind of know how the president's words are being perceived or received by other individuals. It does seem, though, that President Trump was very deeply shaken and moved by this because of his personal relationship with Charlie Kirk. Just this, and I'm not trying to minimize any of the other events or attacks that have happened, but this one appears to have really sort of struck a chord with him, and so perhaps that's one reason why we're sort of hearing the language. But I think we're just going to have to wait and see how other people react to the language that he and perhaps other politicians are using. But I do think President Trump seems to be, very personally affected by this.
Okay, it's still very early on, Professor, but if we could just talk solutions now. We often talk about legislation, but what sort of role can the community or educators, even tech platforms, play in diffusing political hatred to lower down the temperature?
Yeah, you might be asking the wrong person here, because I don't have any grand solutions on this. And this is something I used to think about all the time when I was in government and in my different roles. I was more certainly in government sort of focused on finding the people first who would be intent or mobilizing to commit these actions or these violent attacks. And again, that's really difficult on its own. And things like building community resilience and making sure on the technology side that these social media providers, internet service providers take down extremist content or violent content or rhetoric on their platforms, because in the US, the government really can't do anything about that unless it's very specific and targeted and directed at a certain individual. But there's no grand solutions that have emerged right now here in our country. And so I think it's gonna take sort of a new approach, perhaps, to kind of bring things back down to a different level. But right now, people's passions are very high. Hopefully, we don't see another surge in these kind of attacks or calls for revenge or retaliation. So hopefully, cooler heads will prevail going forward.
All right, Professor, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your insight this morning. Javed Ali, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the University of Michigan.